All right, so I'm here at an interesting time where there's really nothing to talk about. But somehow I'll manage. You know, everywhere I go right now, if I address any issue about the Middle East, there's only one topic that people really want to talk about. And it's 4 letters, starts with an I, ends with an N. Everybody wants to talk about Iran. And I was talking about this with Wendy earlier tonight, and I said the thing that struck me about the last couple of months, where I spent a lot of time out in this issue publicly, was that there was enormous discussion on this issue. It was often exaggerated, it was always emotional, and it was rarely analytical. And it's an important enough topic that it ought to be approached from the standpoint where you can describe it and have a civil discourse over it. So one of the things I'd like to do tonight is actually explain the strengths and the weaknesses of the Iran nuclear deal. And then I want to, after I go through it and I offer a few recommendations about it, because I still think there are things that could be done, not to renegotiate it, because that's obviously not going to happen, but there are some things that could be done that deal with some of its vulnerabilities, and I want to outline those. But I also then want to offer a perspective on the U.S.-Israeli relationship, because there is a perspective now that somehow, given the Israeli opposition to this deal, there's a great deal of concern about what it's going to mean for that relationship. Now, the fact that I have a book that's coming out shortly called Doomed to Succeed, I wrote the book with the title Doomed to Succeed. I didn't write it with Doomed to Succeed ? The sense of irony in the title, Doomed to Succeed, reflects the fact that there are tensions from time to time. There are differences from time to time. But there's also very strong reasons why this relationship has evolved the way it has. And I explain that during the course of the book. And what I want to do tonight is marry these two topics, Iran and the U.S.-Israeli relationship in the aftermath of the Iran deal. So at least at the end of the evening, you'll walk out of here and maybe you'll have a different perspective than the one that you walked in with. Okay, so let me start by talking about the deal. This is a deal that has a number of strengths. And what are those strengths? By the way, when I will pose questions during the evening, and you'll find out that all the questions I pose, I can answer. I know that comes as a surprise, but I can answer my own questions. All right, what are the strengths of this deal? Well, for one thing, it actually does buy you 15 years, for real. For 15 years, the Iranians are not going to be able to have a nuclear weapon. At least it's highly unlikely that they'll be able to have a nuclear weapon. There are 3 ways to basically develop a nuclear weapon. One way is through the enrichment of uranium, one way is through the separation of plutonium, and one way is through covertly doing one of those 2 approaches. There's only 2 kinds of bombs, either a uranium-based bomb or a plutonium-based bomb. So on the one hand, when it relates to the question of uranium enrichment, this deal for 15 years limits how much accumulated low-enriched uranium the Iranians can have. It is low-enriched uranium because it can't enrich above 3.67%, and weapons grade is 80 to 90%. And they are limited for 15 years to 300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium. That's the amount that they can have on hand. That's less than 1 bomb's worth. Today, they have close to 12,000 kilograms of low-enriched uranium, which is about 10 bombs worth. So without a deal, they have 10 bombs worth of material. With this deal, they have 300 kilograms for the next 15 years. So they're not, through the enrichment, they're not going to have a bomb. Now you could say, but they could have a covert program. Well, actually, this deal also makes that very difficult, because to have a covert program, you have to be able to covertly be able to accumulate the material that you would use for enrichment. But to do that, there's a supply chain. You've heard about the fuel cycle. Maybe you haven't, but I'm telling you about the fuel cycle when it comes to enrichment. Well, the key to the fuel cycle is a series of different steps. You start by mining uranium. Then you mill that uranium and you turn it into yellow cake. Then you convert the yellow cake into a gas called UF6 or hexafluoride. And then you take that UF6 and you feed it into a centrifuge, and it spins it at 700 miles an hour, and it separates out a very minute amount of fissile material. If you had all the centrifuges that Iran had completely separated, they wouldn't produce a whole lot of low-enriched uranium. To be able to produce low-enriched uranium as a basis for a bomb, or for fuel for that matter, you have to connect the centrifuges in cascades. And then you have not an arithmetic increase, but you have a geometric one. And when you connect the cascades, then you have an exponential growth. Okay, enough of the tutorial about how to do this. Why do I say they can't have a covert path? Because for 20 years, there is 24/7 monitoring of each of the links in the chain I just described. So where they mine the uranium, there will be 24/7 monitoring. So they can't suddenly secret away or squirrel away some amounts of uranium that they could use for a bomb. Same thing applies to where they mill the uranium and turn it into yellow cake. 24/7 monitoring that makes it very difficult to secret away or squirrel away certain amounts or small amounts of yellow cake. The same thing with the UF6 where they convert the yellow cake. There'll be 24/7 monitoring, and the same thing for the centrifuges. In addition, for another 5 years, there is monitoring of where they store the centrifuges and where, in fact, they assemble centrifuges. All right, so it's very difficult, if not impossible, to have a covert program. So A, when it comes to enrichment, you got a limitation that is less than 1 bomb's worth for 15 years. B, when it comes to a covert program, basically you got monitoring of the whole supply chain, so you really can't be creating a parallel secret program where you're accumulating the material. All right, the third pathway is plutonium separation. Now here you have a heavy water plant. A byproduct of heavy water is plutonium. To be able to create a plutonium bomb, you have to have a reprocessing plant where you take that plutonium and you separate out, again, the fissile material. You pull out the fuel rods. You put them in a cooling pond. You have to have a reprocessing plant to do that. For 15 years, they can't have a reprocessing plant, in addition to the fact that they have to pull the core of the heavy water plant that they have out and fill it with cement. And they put a new core in under a new design that yields much less plutonium. So for 15 years, you really can't have a path to a bomb through enrichment. You can't have a path to a bomb through covert means, at least for enrichment. You can't have a path to a bomb towards plutonium. So it sounds pretty good so far, right? Right? Okay, so if I stop there, you'd say, what's the fuss about? And you might be right. What you don't know is that my own position on this deal was undecided. Now, it wasn't undecided because I thought you didn't buy 15 years. I just showed you actually you do buy 15 years. And it wasn't undecided because I thought you could negotiate an alternative to it. I don't. The other members of the 5+1, they weren't coming back to the table. They weren't going to do that. And if the agreement was blocked here, we would have been the ones to blame, not the Iranians. Our leverage on the Iranians comes where they're the ones who are the odd ones out, not when we're the odd ones out. So I didn't see an alternative to negotiating this either. So you might ask, so how come I was undecided? Because what I'm describing sounds pretty good. I described a reality for 15 years. Okay? So what happens after 15 years? What happens after 15 years is there are no limitations on the size, character, or the quality of the nuclear program that the Iranians can have. Which means after 15 years, basically they can build a very large infrastructure, which, by the way, becomes harder to monitor. The larger it becomes, the harder it is to monitor. They are allowed, starting in year 10 of this agreement, to install 5 advanced models of centrifuges that are dramatically more efficient than the ones that they have now, the IR-1s. Now, the output from those 5 advanced models is very limited for years 10 to 15. Because, again, the output can't exceed, they can't accumulate more than 300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium. So even though they have more advanced models of centrifuges that are dramatically more efficient, they're not going to produce a whole lot. But starting in year 15, no limitations. There will be literally pardon the pun, there'll be an explosion of what they produce starting after year 15 in terms of how quickly they can produce it, the quality of it, and also how big they choose to build the program. Now the problem is after year 15, the gap between where the Iranians are in terms of the nuclear infrastructure they have and the threshold, in a sense, the nuclear threshold status that they create and a weapon will be very small. So the problem isn't for the next 15 years, but there is, in my judgment, a very big problem for what comes after 15 years. Now, if you don't, in my judgment, address that now, you may have a very hard time creating deterrence later. If the world adjusts to the reality that Iran is going to be a nuclear threshold state at a certain point, and by the way, because they'll have such a large nuclear infrastructure, they will not have given up the nuclear weapons option. They have said in this agreement they won't pursue it, develop it, or acquire it. But they'll certainly have the option to do so because of the character of their infrastructure. So if we don't want them to be tempted, they need to know that if they move towards a nuclear weapon after 15 years, the consequence will not be sanctions. If you impose sanctions at that point, that's a way of telling them it's okay for you to have nuclear weapons, because they'll be able to produce nuclear weapons very quickly and present the world with a fait accompli. The posture needs to be one that if you move towards a nuclear weapon at that point, that triggers the use of force and you lose all of your nuclear infrastructure. What I have wanted, and this didn't require renegotiation of the deal, what I have wanted was for us to create a firewall now that the Iranians understand. You have a threshold status, but there's a firewall between that threshold status and weapon status. So I basically made 5 suggestions. Now I've turned them into 6 because now the Congress basically is not going to block this. I had 5 suggestions for what could be done to reduce the vulnerabilities that flow from this agreement. The first one was make our declaratory policy much more blunt. It isn't enough to say all options are on the table. We need to say, if you move towards a nuclear weapon, that triggers the use of force. And Iran, by the way, if they're moving towards a nuclear weapon, it means they have violated the agreement. They say in the agreement, as I said before, they won't pursue, develop, or acquire nuclear weapons. So if they dash towards a weapon, they just broke their word in the agreement. So we should be justified in saying, if you break your word in the agreement, particularly after year 15, it triggers the use of force. Why is it important to do that now? It's especially important to do it now, A, so the Iranians get used to this. They become socialized to it. No surprises later on. But B, because the rest of the world accepts that the legitimate option to deal with an Iranian dash towards a weapon is the use of force. If you don't establish this now, during this presidency, with Obama, who is perceived by the rest of the world as clearly not being anxious to use force, if he says the right response to them cheating after year 15 if they dash is the use of force, because that's the one way to ensure that you deter them, the rest of the world is much more likely to accept that that's legitimate. The more the notion of the legitimacy of the use of force is established now, the greater the likelihood of deterrence later. I worry, and I'm not a natural worrier, but I worry that if we wait for the present successors to do this, we may not find the same kind of international response that you would find right now. So my first suggestion is make the declaratory policy blunt. Now the President sought to address this concern in a letter to Congressman Nadler, and he has one sentence in there that's quite good that refers to the fact that we'll use all means, including military means, to prevent the goal. And the goal in that is the antecedent in this sentence was preventing nuclear weapons. The next sentence, however, is quite weak because it says, if the Iranians dash, all the options available to us today will remain available to us for the life of the agreement and beyond. All the options will remain available if they dash. If they dash towards a weapon, they've made a conscious decision to violate the agreement and to go for weapons. So they need to know bluntly what it means, and the rest of the world needs to hear it. So that was suggestion number 1. Suggestion number 2 was For 15 years, they can't enrich above 3.67%. After 15 years, there's nothing stated in the agreement about limitations on enrichment, meaning they could enrich to weapons grade, meaning they can do highly enriched uranium. There's nothing in the agreement that says they can't do that. And the Iranians, by the way, if you look at them historically, the Iranians have said they have a right to enrichment. They said the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty gives them a right to enrichment. It does no such thing. It simply doesn't say they don't have a right to enrich. So the absence of saying something has been taken by them to mean that they have the right. So if there's nothing stated about the limitation on enrichment after year 15, they will assume they have a right to produce highly enriched uranium. There is no legitimate civilian purpose for highly enriched uranium. Should I repeat that line? There is no legitimate civilian purpose for highly enriched uranium. If there is no such legitimate purpose, then we ought to be clear now, not later, if you produce highly enriched uranium after year 15, that's a trigger, because there isn't a justification for it. Now, the third recommendation I made, and some have been able to restrain their enthusiasm for this one, but I consider it to be actually very important. I recommended that we provide Israel the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. The Massive Ordnance Penetrator, also known as the MOP, is a 30,000-pound bomb. You've heard the term bunker buster. This is not a bunker buster. This is a mountain buster. One of the enrichment sites that the Iranians created is in a place called Fordo. It's built into a mountain. You know, think about it. You build an enrichment site into a mountain. You do that because you have peaceful intent? You do that because you have a civilian program? The size, by the way, is the number of centrifuges that you can put in there is 3,000, which bears no relationship to a commercial program. So the Massive Ordnance Penetrator is a non-nuclear bomb. It's not only 30,000 pounds, it has a fuse that doesn't ignite until it penetrates deep underground. Now, the Israelis don't have a plane that could carry a 30,000-pound bomb. We have two. One is a B-52 and the other is a B-2. And I suggested that sometime before year 15, we should provide that to the Israelis. We should commit to it now. Why? Many may question, at the end of the day, if the Iranians dashed where there will use force. Nobody questions, at the end of the day, if the Iranians dash that the Israelis will use force. So if you provide the Israelis the MOP, which is a means they presently don't have to take out Fordo, the message to the Iranians is, you know, if you think that we don't mean what we say, think again. We do. So that was my third recommendation. My fourth recommendation was when you want deterrence to take hold, one of the critical things you actually want to do is to create a pattern of behavior over time that is highly consistent. So I wanted to show that whatever the transgression is on the Iranian side, that there's a price. The Iranians will cheat on this deal. They're much less likely to cheat in a big provocative way, because you've heard of the snapback function in the agreement. It actually was very cleverly designed to be able to maintain the suspension of sanctions. There's no termination of the sanctions regime for 8 years. There's a suspension of the sanctions regime for 8 years. So if there's a violation and you want to continue the suspension, in the Security Council, everybody has to vote affirmatively. So if we veto it, it means automatically you snap back, because you can't continue, you can't maintain the sanctions regime. You can't maintain the suspension of the sanctions regime if we veto it. So that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it was very cleverly done, and it does mean if there's a big violation, the snapback is likely to work. Now, why do I say if there's a big violation? Because the Iranians say right after we say this in the agreement, the Iranians say, and if you do this, we'll no longer implement our obligations. So guess what? If there's a small violation, are we going to snap back and run the risk that the whole thing is going to collapse? Will the other members who negotiate this, will they feel that way too? Probably not. So what you need is you need to ensure there are smaller penalties for smaller violations. A, because that's the way they're likely to cheat. And then, by the way, there's an additional reason why they'll cheat that way. The Iranians will want to test how good the verification is. So they'll test along the margins. And when we catch them, say, oh, it was a mistake. we're supposed to only enrich to 3.67%. No, we enriched to 6%. It was just a mistake. You know us, we're good guys. It was just a mistake. I want a pattern of behavior established from low to high. You violate, you pay a price. It's not you violate, oh, you made a mistake, just correct the mistake. You violate, you pay a price. So that was my fourth recommendation. Now I had a fifth recommendation that was tied to the deal, but not tied to the nuclear side of the deal. The Iranians will get sanctions relief once they have fulfilled their major nuclear obligations in the deal, which will probably take about 6 months. For them to reduce 12,000 kilograms down to 300, for them to be able to take the core of the heavy water plant out and fill it with cement, for them to reduce, they have 9,500 operating centrifuges today. They have to reduce to 5,060. They can actually have 6,000 that are available to be operating, 5,060 can operate. They have overall today, they have 19,500. Don't worry, there's not a quiz on this afterwards. I'm just doing this so you get a sense of what the numbers are and why it will take them 6 months. They have to take the difference between 6,000 and 19,500, 13,500, and they have to store those. And that's not, these are delicate machines, so it's not a simple thing. So you run through each of the things they have to do. They have to set up the monitoring system for the whole supply chain that is to the satisfaction of the IAEA, and they agreed that there will be state-of-the-art monitoring. So all of this is going to take them time, probably 6 months. Once they do that, they get sanctions relief. Now the problem with sanctions relief is, of course, that suddenly they got a whole lot more money to cause trouble in the region. Now the fact is, any deal that we did, any nuclear deal with the Iranians, was going to provide them sanctions relief. Had we gotten a nuclear deal that was better than the one I just described, they were going to get sanctions relief. So you can't criticize this deal because it provides sanctions relief. But you have to also have a safeguard against what they're likely to do once they have a whole lot more money. You know, what I heard frequently was, well, they're going to put all the money into domestic purposes. They have these huge infrastructure needs. So that's where they're going to put the money. First of all, I said to people, you know, last time I checked, we have huge infrastructure needs. We put all our money into it? They're going to put all their money into the infrastructure needs? I don't think so. But there's a better argument than that. The supreme leader is acquiescing in this deal. He's not giving up his ideology. All you can do is listen to his speeches. You know, last week he gave a speech where he said Israel won't exist in 25 years. This is the real guy. You know, this is who he is. He is not giving up his ideology, and one of the consequences of acquiescing in the deal, he will need to prove he isn't giving up his ideology, and that means they'll do more in the region. He will compensate the Revolutionary Guard that didn't like the deal, because they dominate the Iranian economy without the deal. With the deal, they won't dominate the Iranian economy. So he'll compensate them. So they will cause more trouble in the region. There will be more money that goes to Hezbollah, probably to Hamas, certainly to the other Shia militias in Iraq. I propose that we do two things, that we have targeted sanctions for destabilizing behavior in the region, so they know when they do it, there's a price, and that we should start contingency planning with the Israelis and others to plan now, today, what are the options we're going to have to use to employ against their increased troublemaking in the region. So that was my fifth recommendation. And then my sixth recommendation was something I said, all right, look, if there's going to be a deal, one way to begin to mend the fences with the Israelis on the one hand and meet our mutual needs on the other, when it comes to implementation, how about a joint implementation committee between the United States and Israel? The Israelis for sure will be vigilant about how this is being implemented. And I can tell you, back in 2009, when I was in the administration, one of the things we did starting in 2009, we asked the Israelis to look at the sanctions regime at that time and tell us what they knew about where the Iranians were evading it. They engaged in all sorts of tricks to try to get around it. We wanted to plug the holes in it, and the Israelis were expert at that. We also asked them to tell us which sanctions they thought would have the greatest impact, and they did. It helped to shape our approach to how we design the sanctions. Here, you can imagine how vigilant the Israelis are going to be on implementation because the stakes for them are very high. A joint implementation committee with them will reassure the Israelis on the one hand, and will also give us a higher level of confidence that we really are keeping on top of implementation. And the implementation is the key to this deal ultimately. All right, so there I gave you a perspective on how to think about the deal and some of the potential remedies. Those remedies were not undertaken to my satisfaction before there was a vote on the agreement. But there is legislation that is working now. And it's being promoted, and I hope that there can be, since there is an interesting reality. While there isn't too much of a bipartisan consensus on anything, there is a bipartisan consensus on Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon, and there's a bipartisan consensus that they should pay a price if they engage in destabilizing behavior in the region. And I would like there to be a bipartisan approach to the legislation. It's been drafted by 2 Democrats in the Senate, Cardin and Bennett, but I would like to see Republicans join that, because these issues, you can't block the agreement, but you can deal with some of its vulnerabilities, and the legislation is designed to do that. And if it's truly bipartisan, then I think there's a potential for the administration to go along with it. All right, so that's how to think about where we are in the deal and its aftermath. How about the relationship between the United States and Israel, particularly given what was Prime Minister Netanyahu's opposition to the deal, which was not subtle, and what was a determined effort on a lot of the Jewish groups to support opposition to the deal. You know, some people may say, well, now we're really in trouble. Now the relationship is really heading a bleak period. Well, again, I said I was going to offer you some perspective, and I'm going to offer you some perspective. First, I want to note, it is not unprecedented for American presidents and Israeli prime ministers not to be bosom buddies, not even to be friends. If you go back in time, I mean really back in time, Truman, interestingly enough, had a relationship with Chaim Weizmann, who was the president of Israel but not the prime minister. Truman did not have much of a relationship with Ben-Gurion until after Truman was president. Eisenhower basically had no relationship and pretty much threatened the Israelis early on. When the Eisenhower administration came in, they were determined to distance from Israel. They felt that Truman was close to Israel, which is interesting. You have to read my book to see that, in fact, Truman was balanced towards Israel. But, you know, the fact is Truman imposed an arms embargo, both before the Declaration of Statehood and maintained it after the Declaration of Statehood. For the life of the Truman administration, there were no arms provided to Israel. He waited 6 months after the Declaration of Statehood until Israel had its first election before he was prepared to provide any loans or any grant assistance, which was not a huge amount of money that was provided. What he did that was singular was to recognize Israel when it declared itself. But in terms of practical steps that were taken, he provided loans and some grants that totaled about $165 million for the life of the Truman administration until 52, through the end of 52. This is at a time when Israel was absorbing a population larger than the Jewish population that existed in Israel. $165 million didn't go very far even then to deal with that. That's what Truman provided. When Eisenhower came in, he suspended one of the loans, actually suspended the outstanding loans that existed because Israel was developing the Jordan River. It's a pretty amazing thing. You know, the Eisenhower position was we shouldn't do that. Secretary of State Dulles went on a trip in the spring of 1953 after the administration came in. And what he did is he went to Arab capitals and he said, we won't permit Israeli aggression. The first thing he said when he met with the Lebanese. You know, we won't permit Israeli aggression. Interesting frame of words, since it was Israel that was invaded after it declared statehood. First arms sales were actually from Kennedy. Kennedy is the first one to begin to change things. But if you look at some of the personal relationships, Reagan doesn't get along with Bacon. George H.W. Bush, when Robert Gates in an oral history was asked about who was the one leader that George H.W. Bush personally disliked and didn't get along with, and Gates said there was only one, Yitzhak Shamir. And Bill Clinton, who when you read the book you'll see he's the one person who finds it very difficult to create any distance with Israel. He thinks it's just wrong because we're Israel's only friend. Bill Clinton at one point was so mad at Prime Minister Netanyahu during Prime Minister Netanyahu's first incarnation when Netanyahu came to the country. He didn't see him, he didn't talk to him, and at one point their planes were parked next to each other at LAX. So personal relations between presidents and prime ministers, there's precedent for what we see. But even on the substance, to put this really in perspective, there was one president in response to a major Israeli effort to block this president's initiative in the Congress with a lot of support from the Jewish organizations. One president said that it is not the business of other nations to make American foreign policy. This was the president at a press conference, and he was addressing what the Israeli government was doing and what the Jewish organizations were doing. Never have we had such a blunt statement that implied dual loyalty. You think that president was Barack Obama who gave that press conference? Do you? You don't, only because of the way I framed it. It was Ronald Reagan, October 1, 1981, on AWACS. Jimmy Carter, before that on F-15, there was a 3-month battle over selling F-15s to Saudi Arabia. You know, George H.W. Bush on the loan guarantees said he was one lonely guy, you know, having to deal with, quote, thousands of lobbyists descending on the Congress. In all these cases, in Carter's case of the F-15, in Reagan's case of AWACS, in George H.W. Bush's case of the loan guarantees, and now on Iran, the president prevailed. In each of those cases, the president prevailed because presidents make foreign policy, and when presidents decide something is in the national interest, it doesn't matter if you're lobbying the Congress, presidents prevail. But after all these cases, it's worth noting something. After Jimmy Carter won the battle on the F-15s, it's Jimmy Carter who produces $3 billion a year for Israel from that point on. Now it's true, it's because of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. But he does it. Even though, if you read his diary, which I did, can't write these kinds of books unless you go through everything. In his diaries, what comes through very clearly is that he really doesn't like Menachem Begin. At one point in his diary, he says, when the Nobel Prize is awarded to Sadat and Begin, in his diary he writes, Sadat deserved it, Begin didn't. So here's Jimmy Carter. He's the guy, after the fight on F-15s, who produces $3 billion a year for Israel, and that becomes institutionalized. Ronald Reagan, after the AWACS fight, and after he suspends, Ronald Reagan is the only president to suspend arms shipments to Israel as a punishment. And after he does, first he wins the AWACS fight, and then after he suspends F-16s to Israel in December of 1981, because Israel has annexed the Golan Heights, actually they extended their law and administration of the Golan Heights, it is Ronald Reagan, starting in 1984, who creates the architecture for the security relationship we have with Israel today. Reagan creates, and for the first time, treats Israel as a strategic partner where we have something to gain from what we do with Israel. So it's not just shared values, but interests. And he creates cooperation, a rubric for cooperation, for security cooperation, for military cooperation, for intelligence cooperation that didn't exist prior to that time. And the structure that he built has been incorporated by every succeeding president, even those who didn't have a warm attachment to Israel necessarily, but who treated this as something that was a baseline that you advanced. George H.W. Bush, after he wins the loan guarantee, what does he do? As part of getting to Madrid, on the way to the Madrid Peace Conference, he presses 44 countries to either establish or reestablish diplomatic relations with Israel, including Russia and China. He's the one who completely opens the gates to Soviet Jewry going to Israel, including no longer requiring a stop in Vienna where they could, if they go to Vienna, they could go to the US or they go to Israel. He lifts that so they can go directly to Israel. George H.W. Bush. And Barack Obama now, who says he's going to conclude a memorandum of understanding for security assistance to Israel for the next 10 years before the end of his term. And in his letter to Gerald Nadler says, Israel's security is sacrosanct. And the word sacrosanct I'm quoting. So how to explain these troubles on the one hand, these differences on the one hand, this tension on the one hand, and the fact that we always tend to move in a certain direction. Well, think about the following. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And the same forces that threaten Israel threaten us. And every president has a way of seeing that. And even if you think that things look grim now, think about the following. Look at the Middle East. I'm tempted to quote Henny Youngman. Now take the Middle East, please. Look at the Middle East. The Middle East is going to be characterized by a fundamental struggle over identity. And who's going to define it? Between radical Islamists, non-Islamists. Every Arab state is, in one way or the other, threatened internally. And that's going to be the case for at least the next 10 years, and I would guess for probably the next 20 years. But there's one country that actually has a set of institutions. There's one country in the region that has a rule of law, a separation of powers, an independent judiciary, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, a vibrant civil society, complete artistic freedom, women's rights are respected, gay rights are respected. There's one country like that. There's one country that has the institutions. It has its own internal challenges too. The difference is this one country called Israel has institutions that can manage them. There's one country that has regularly scheduled and unregularly scheduled elections where the loser accepts the outcome. There's one country like that, and that's Israel. And in an environment where you're going to have uncertainty, conflict, turmoil, there'll be one country where there's a degree of predictability and you can count on will basically be supportive of the United States. And that's Israel. And at the end of the day, one of the reasons that this relationship has evolved the way it has is because of that simple reality. It is more true today than it's ever been true before. I'll stop there. The question was, I'll skip the preface, which was entirely laudatory and needn't be repeated, except to my mother. The question was, I kept talking about monitors, and the question was, who are the monitors? It is IAEA monitoring, and it is done, there's a combination of on-site inspections and 24/7 monitoring through cameras that are placed in locations where you can constantly see what's going on. There are also electronic seals on items that are being stored. So if there's any tampering, it's known immediately. And that's what the monitoring is conducted by the IAEA. We can provide information to the IAEA at any point if there's a suspect site. What I didn't talk about was the suspect sites. You've all heard of 24 days to be able to, before we can have access to a suspect site. You have known sites and the supply chain that are under 24/7 monitoring, period. The issue of suspect sites comes in if we get information and we say, we have reason to believe that there's activity going on in X place that is a violation of the agreement. We give that to the IAEA. The IAEA goes to the Iranians at that point and they say, we would like to see that tomorrow. And the Iranians can say, hey, give us a justification. Now the way the agreement is drafted, there's a 14-day period where the IAEA and the Iranians can go back and forth. At the end of 14 days, if the Iranians are still not permitting access, there's a 7-day period for the 5+1 to discuss this. And if they decide at the end of 7 days that there needs to be access, the Iranians have 3 days after that before access. Now that sounds really cumbersome, and I'm not going to stand up here and say it's not, but I should tell you that under the additional protocol, which applies to every other country, the same procedure works absent one thing. There's actually no time limit at all. Today, with every other country that's under the additional protocol of the NPT, if there's a suspect site, they have to grant access to it at some point, but there's no time limit as to when it is. So actually the 24 days is an improvement over what exists with everybody else. Now the question about 24 days that you might ask, even though you didn't, but I'm anticipating that you might, is what can they do in that 24 days? If it has fissile material, you can't clean it up in 24 days. It has a signature that lasts for a much longer period of time, years actually. If they're engaged in weapons experiments or weapons designs that don't involve fissile material, that would be a problem. We would be watching it. They would know we knew something was going on, but anything that's small that doesn't have fissile material, they could probably, they could scrub it and they could probably remove it. But even that would put them under some pressure, and they'd have to know, how come we know? And watching them, they never know what we know, and when they suddenly become suspicious that we know something, it affects not just their effort to try to hide it, but they have to develop all new routines, which becomes, in a lot of ways, somewhat disruptive for them. Having said that, look, am I thrilled about the 24-day provision? No, I'm not thrilled about it. Back there? The question was, does the Obama administration have a grand strategy towards Iran? I'm tempted to say I'm still looking for a grand strategy towards the region, and I don't see that. I don't believe there's a grand strategy towards Iran. What I see is a genuine desire, first, to try to prevent the Iranians from having a nuclear weapon and using diplomacy to that end. Do I think that there is a desire or a hope that maybe over time, the fact that there's an agreement on the nuclear issue could be turned into something more significant and help to produce changes that might empower the more pragmatic types within Iran? Yes, I think there's a hope. But hope is not a policy. It can drive an aspiration, it can shape what you hope to do, but it takes two to tango. And as I said, the three speeches that the Supreme Leader has made recently, each one is worse than the one before it. And each of that, in my mind, some of the administration say that's just domestic politics. No, I think that's the Supreme Leader who wants to demonstrate that he's not changing his revolutionary ideology one iota. And this is a deal that's a transaction for him. It's not going to transform the relationship. In the near term, I think Iranian behavior, as I was suggesting before, will get worse, not better, in the region. It is possible. Anybody who says it's not possible that there could be some change over time, look, of course it's possible. It's even possible that if the Iranians become, again, sort of integrated into the international economy and dependent on it, that could have a change over time. We know that the Iranian public doesn't embrace the ideology, so it could create a change over time. But you can't bank on that. Your policy has to be based on what they do and what they say, and it's pretty clear what they say is pretty bad, and it's also pretty clear that what they do is pretty bad. So if you want to change the balance of power in Iran, the way to change the balance of power in Iran is to raise the cost to those who embody the revolutionary ideology. If it was the sanctions that drove them to negotiate on the nuclear issue because the price was too high, if you want to change their behavior in the region, the way to change their behavior in the region is to make it clear that the Revolutionary Guard is costing Iran a lot. Make it more expensive for them to engage in bad behavior in the region, not less expensive. If I were shaping a grand strategy towards the region right now, I would start with the premise that every single day I'm going to weaken the radical Islamists, whether it's ISIS or it's meaning the ISIS Sunni-led radical Islamists, or it's Iran and the Shia militias. That would be my starting point. And I would find ways to compete and raise the cost to each for what they're doing. Okay, because I don't know how much time ultimately we're going to have, why don't I take 3 questions at a time? That way we'll cover more. All right, so I'm going to take them from both sides. Here? Okay, so I'm going to take them in reverse order. So let me start with that one. That question was that we haven't really seen the side agreements. How can I be confident that the agreement's going to work for 15 years when we haven't seen the side agreements? I'm glad you asked the question because there's a lot of misinformation, particularly about that point. We did see the side agreements. The administration saw the side agreements. The side agreements were between the IAEA and the Iranians. They related to two separate issues. One was how they're going to deal with the possible military dimension of the Iranian program, and that dealt with Parshin, among other things. It also involved access to documents and people. And the other related to what was a roadmap for the limited R&D on the advanced centrifuges that were going to be deployed, that are going to be installed between years 10 and 15. So the administration did see these. The IAEA shared the content of these agreements with each of the members of the 5+1. It was a confidential agreement, so the administration couldn't show the actual document to people on the Hill, but they could brief on the full content of it. And my understanding is they did in classified settings. Now the issue of they conducted their own inspections, you have to understand what they did was the following. The IAEA told the Iranians, here's where we want you to take samples. And cameras would be trained on them as the Iranians took the samples. So it's not as if the Iranians went without being unseen and took samples from wherever they wanted. They took samples exactly where the IAEA designated that they take them, and they were monitored the whole time that they did it. So, do I think that's a perfect result? No, but I think we have to be accurate about actually what was done. And so it wasn't the case of the Iranians just doing inspections without anybody watching and picking it up and providing it with no monitoring whatsoever. And so for I do think, given the nature of the kind of monitoring that's going to take place, it will not be simple for the Iranians to cheat in a big way. Will they cheat in a small way? I said it to you. They're going to cheat in a small way because they're going to test the verification, for sure. The Iranians were supposed to reveal, according to the NPT, wherever they were building nuclear facilities, especially enrichment facilities. We caught them twice doing it. They didn't reveal it. They never knew when we knew. Now, they also won't know what we know when we know it. So, is it a perfect agreement? No. Is there any arms control agreement that's a perfect agreement? No way. I started off as an arms controller. I can tell you, no arms control agreement is going to be without flaws. This agreement is no exception to that. Part of the problem with the agreement was the way it was oversold, that it was claiming it was something it wasn't. All right. The question on it's really not the Iranian military that's active in Venezuela, it's the IRGC. The IRGC is a parallel, the Revolutionary Guard are parallel to the Iranian military. They're active in Venezuela, they're much more active in places, like Paraguay and Argentina. Are they building missile bases there? No. Do we have reason to be concerned about their missile development? Yes. All their missiles are basically knockoffs that they got from the North Koreans. And they're continuing to develop that. So that is something that we can be concerned about. Do I know why this isn't covered more by the media? I don't know why it's not covered more by the media. All right, now on the first question, which has to do with the Iranians will get, the sanctions release they'll get will provide them in 6 months about access to $56 billion worth of assets that are in frozen accounts today. There's more, but those monies are actually obligated for projects in China. Now the question you raised was not just about the sanctions relief and the amount of resources they get. You were raising the fact that there will continue to be American sanctions on Iran that relate to terrorism and human rights violations. And some of those sanctions do have implications for financial institutions that we have found responsible or guilty of money laundering or participating in terrorist activities. And any company, foreign company, that would do business with those firms would be subject to our continuing sanctions. And that is a fact. Now, the implication of your question was that might have a chilling effect on on foreign businesses. And I think it's more likely to have a chilling effect on some of the financial institutions than it is on a lot of, the Italian car companies are rushing in there, the French are bringing in business. There will be some businesses that will be reluctant to get deeply involved there for fear that if sanctions are going to be snapped back, they could lose their investment. There was for a time a reference to what was known as a grandfather clause in the agreement. And some people interpreted that clause to imply that once you had an investment, that was untouchable if sanctions had to be snapped back. And that's not true. You can start your investment, but if the sanctions snap back, that investment is then subject to sanction, and you're subject to sanctions. So I do think there isn't going to, the sense that there's going to be a gold rush there is probably overstated in some respects. Truth be told, the level of improvement in the Iranian economy as a result of the relief of sanctions is not going to be as great as some believe, partly because the major problem they have economically is their mismanagement. It's not just the sanctions. One of the reasons that the Supreme Leader, in my judgment, will never publicly embrace this deal, he'll simply acquiesce and allow it to go through their modulus, is because he's retaining his options. You know, if things go badly, he's going to blame Rouhani. By the way, he's had a bad relationship with every Iranian president. You know, it doesn't, not just Ahmadinejad, not Khatami, every Iranian president, because there's a basic tension in terms of authority. He's the ultimate decision maker. But Iranian presidents inevitably are responsible for trying to get something done. I expect that he will retain his distance from the agreement, even though he'll allow it to go through. And if it proves to be disappointing, we'll find that he becomes highly critical of Rouhani. We'll see. My guess is there will be more companies that want to go in there and do business than we would like. It won't be as great as we fear, but it will be more than we would like. And it will, their economy will improve, but not in the way, at the pace, and in the expectation that they now have. Okay, I got the sign that I can take 2 more questions, and if I take more than 2 more questions, there's a little trap door here. I fall through it, and you don't see me. All right, 1 there, and 1 here. All right, so I'll take, again, in reverse order. The question was, what confidence can we have that this agreement will really be implemented? The North Korean agreement wasn't. The Iranians will look at the North Koreans and say, all right, they got away with it, why can't we? It's a fair question. The one profound difference between the two is North Koreans don't mind being completely isolated. The Iranians hate being completely isolated. And my guess is they're much less likely to cheat the way the North Koreans did, simply because they really actually have a public that they don't completely dismiss. I mean, if the Supreme Leader really completely dismissed the public, there's no reason for him to accept this. And yet, as I said, in the end, he's going to acquiesce in it. The proof is in the pudding, though. I mean, the key is how we implement. One of the reasons I suggested a joint implementation committee between us and the Israelis, I can see, let me just say this abstractly, I can certainly see that there are some among the 5+1 who will be prone to explain away every Iranian behavior. I'd like to have a joint committee with the Israelis because they'll be looking. And they'll bring it to everybody's attention. And it'll be a whole lot harder to run away from it if it's really visible that they're cheating and something's not being done about it. So I want to hedge against that possibility that you're raising. You know, I look at this agreement, as I said, I see a series of vulnerabilities associated with it. But I didn't see, look, it's not blocked, it's going to happen, and there's not going to be a renegotiation. So what can we do to contend with those vulnerabilities? Well, one of the ideas I'm suggesting is a joint implementation with the Israelis, because their stakes are going to be really high in ensuring that it actually gets implemented and exposing things if there's cheating that's not being addressed. On the question of lesser infractions and you know, what are the penalties? What I mean by it is this. I don't expect that the other members of the 5+1, meaning the Russians and the Chinese, are going to be quick to want to impose penalties for lesser kinds of infractions. I want us to at least have understandings with the Europeans and not have to negotiate later on what the penalty ought to be. We ought to establish what the penalty is now. I mean, I gave you one example of a penalty that you can anticipate. Instead of not a penalty you can anticipate, an infraction you can anticipate. You know, assume that they enrich to 6% instead of 3.67%. All right, we should agree with the Europeans what's the price they're going to pay, and we should communicate that to the Iranians in advance. You know, it can be certain kinds of sanctions. You can be on a sector. You know, you can decide that, all right, you know, we're going to cut off access to certain trade an automobiles, cars. I mean, I'm giving you an example of something. But rather than me working through what the penalties should be, if we don't establish what some of the low-end penalties are now, we'll end up negotiating them later on. If we have to negotiate them with the Europeans and others, the chances of them actually being implemented are pretty low. So that's what I was getting at. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Brian. And Jim.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.